Уважаемые коллеги, я прошу побыстрее занимать свои места.
Dear colleagues, I would urge you to be seated quickly enough. We are running slightly behind the schedule, but I'm hoping that our discussion will be worth the delay of some delay and to prolong our session. Now, let me say that I'm very pleased to moderate the session. As Confucius taught us, ritual is something that's important for any conference. Part of the ritual is to determine the sequence of the items to be discussed at each session. So when we were planning our agenda of our press conference, we're thinking long and hard what to put first. Of course, the matters of economic cooperation and political aspects of bilateral relations, they're important indeed. But in the end, we decided to start our discussion with a more general topic, to talk first about the role of our two countries in the regional and global security in the changing context of the world politics. Indeed, the world is changing. New opportunities are coming up, new challenges arise, and the role of Russia and China in this new world does deserve serious discussion. If we listen to our colleagues in the West, the dominant point of view is the notion that Russia and China, each country in its own way, are acting as a revisionist type of power. That is, the powers that are not happy with the existing status quo in the world and in the Asian Pacific region, and which are trying to change the status quo. Russia largely more through in political, military sphere, but China in the sphere of economy. I think there are few people will be found in this audience who will likely agree with this interpretation of our policy. I think that both the speeches by Chairman Xi Jinping at the Davos meeting and also the latest speech by President Putin, they do confirm the fact that both Russia and China are acting as responsible conservative players on the international arena. However, this topic does deserve very close attention indeed. And I want to say that today here, from my standpoint, we have a unique panel up here. In terms of the composition of the participants' professional representation. And I should think we'll have very interesting, and fruitful conversation. Let me start off our discussion by giving the floor to Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of Russian Federation, Igor Vladimirovich Margulov. Welcome. Thank you, esteemed friends. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers of the conference, which has become quite traditional, the third international conference, Russia-China, New Quality Relations, for the beautiful, wonderful opportunity at the end of May to get together and to have the opportunity to conduct such systemic analysis of our current state and the prospects of our bilateral relations, the development and the influence on the changing situation internationally, the world politics and the economics. Today, at this session, we are talking about the Russian-Chinese interaction in tackling the global and regional problems. Let me say right away that for Russia and China to be effective in their interaction in the sphere. The whole system has been built, which has the huge reserve of safety and which enables one to constructively tackle the most challenging tasks. Of course, the basis for this strong system is the agreeing of the root interests of our two countries, our joint commitment to the polycentric world order. Those are the obvious things that's sitting on the surface, but as important as the interstate dialogue between our countries has been de-ideologized. Discussions on difficult historical matters in our relations have been put outside the brackets. What's important there, neither country interferes into internal affairs of the other, respects the internal order and structure of the partner, and also provides support as far as the key, most important matters, which is most important, safety and sovereignty of each state. And as Vladimir noted quite rightly, international situation, to put it mildly and diplomatically, is not getting more simple. We have come to the principally new stage of historical development to do with the strengthening of new centers of power, which reflects the natural aspirations of the peoples to independently determine their destinies. And these process, it will be fair to say, are developing not in a linear fashion. So the numerous obstacles in the path of such development, the main of which, let it be open about this, attempts by narrow groups of countries to continue to push through the concept which has been proven to be insufficient, incompetent of one polar world order to impose their will, their models of development, their values. And as we've been seeing from the very recent examples, they even prepared to stoop to the use of various methods of violence. As far as the situation in the region of Asia and Pacific Ocean, of course, the interests of Russia and China are very closely related and intertwined in this particular region, and there's a very great conflict potential still remains there, which drives the relevance of our continuation of our mutual work with China, and not just with China, but with other partners in this region, work towards forming strong and adequate modern architecture on equal and undivided safety. The initiative of this work was put forward by the Russian Federation back in 2010. We put forward this initiative. We were vigorously supported by our Chinese friends and a number of Asian ASEAN partners. So this work is now underway actively and supported by the Chinese, the Indians. The initiatives on this score tend to agree in many ways, even though some nuances, some points of difference in the approaches, but also important is to move forward to trying to achieve the synergy as far as the views on the future of security, and aiming at agreeing, coordinating the rules of behavior that will be the same for all, and building the systems in the Asian and Pacific region system of relations. The optimal form of this work is Asian Summit, which where all the main players represented. Within this format, 6 such dialogues have already been held on the topic of regional security. The latest one was held in Thailand quite recently, just the other day. The main result of the session, most of the participants in the Eastern Asian summits are determined to continue the serious conversation. And here, as we understand, the role of China and Russia as the leading players in this region, their role is definitely indispensable. Another theme of our interaction on the international arena is our systemic efforts with China to correlate the construction of Eurasian Union and the building of the one Silk Road program. So the momentum is gaining. Work on for new agreement between Eurasian Union and Russia, and a number of joint integration projects. Thus, the foundation is laid for a new level of cooperation in the format of 5, Eurasian 5, and +1, which objectively will form the foundation of the new wide-scale integration outline as put forward by President Putin, what is referred to as the Greater Eurasian Partnership, which envisages establishing multilateral cooperation, Eurasian Union, Shanghai Organization, ASEAN, and in the future other interested countries of Asia and Europe, including even our partners in the Euro Union, with the aim of developing new standards of trade and investment, to tackling major technological issues and building effective production chains. We value very highly support of China, of Russian initiative in this area. What the point of difference in our vision of such partnership is the fact that it should be based on the mutual respect for different national models of development. Nobody's trying to impose anything on anybody. This partnership should be open, flexible, proceeding at different speeds, at different levels, and to provide for connecting correlation with other integration formats. At present, our country and China have already started basically the technical calculation of this partnership. So the technical economic feasibility study is being made on the expediency of the development of the dialogue in this direction. And of course, I need to mention with a feeling of satisfaction that there's increasing demand internationally for such kind of approach. The most vivid piece of evidence of this is the recent forum, One Belt, One Road, with participation of leaders of about 31 countries of Asia, Europe, Africa, and Latin America, where basically it was demonstrated the single willingness of the parties to join efforts towards various integration formats. It's important to utilize those opportunities. We are planning to do so, and we propose the continuation of conversation on this topic at the third Oriental Economic Forum, early September in Vladivostok. Of course, can't but mention as far as Russian-Chinese interaction on the international arena, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Next to me is the esteemed chairman of this organization, Mr. Rashid Alimov. I want to say with satisfaction that effective Russian-Chinese tandem at the Shanghai Organization is the logical continuation of the multilateral strategic partnership of our two countries. Thanks to the joint work with Peking and other partners in these organizations, within a short space of time, historically speaking, we're able to turn Shanghai Organization into an organization very influential, very widely recognized platform for regional cooperation in politics, security, economic and humanitarian ties. The next objectives of Shanghai organizations will be soon examined at the meeting of leaders at the summit in Astana. That summit is going to be historical without exaggeration. As you know, it's expected to take a decision full membership to extend full membership to India and Pakistan. The accession of these influential players will definitely increase potential of the organization, especially as far as combating international terrorism and as far as trade and economic cooperation. Incidentally, speaking of Russian-China interaction with reference to South Asia and overall reference to the whole Asian region, I want to mention also the former dialogue between China, India, China, which enables three leading powers of Eurasia to coordinate their approaches towards relevant international matters and to join efforts to counteract a set of challenges and threats of regional safety which our countries have to deal with. Within the framework of three countries, we started to establish interdepartmental cooperation aiming at establishing coordinated positions at different multilateral platforms. Let me mention one of those platforms, multilateral platforms, which is BRICS in China. As you know, China is the holds the chairmanship of this organization in 2017, and we are confident the China's chairmanship will be a new milestone in the development of this organization and ensure the further influence of this organization in international politics and economy. The substantive program of work for this year covers the entire spectrum of areas of multilateral cooperation of BRICS, the main of which reflects the relevance of this coordination, the interest of all the countries together to build and develop BRICS together. As far as our introduction on international arena, I need but to mention the Security Council, General Assembly of United Nations Organization. Here we cooperate very closely with China. Jointly we stand for the need of very strict observance of the principles of the rule of law, respect for the Charter of the Union, prerogative of the Security Council as the main organ responsible for maintaining international order and safety. We in solidarity stand for peace, political settlement of conflicts without double standards, without unilateral action or any attempts to replace regimes. We also, our approaches tend to coincide as far as countering terrorist threats. Our never-changing priority, including the Security Council, countering attempts to revise the history, regenerate militarism and Nazism. It's especially relevant when in a number of countries there are some dangerous revanchist tendencies being observed in a number of countries. Very important attention we give, of course, our mutual work with China as far as the issues of Korean Peninsula, including nuclear. That interaction as far as Korean Peninsula is characterized by a high degree of trust and practical coordination. With our Chinese partners, we're at one as far as rejecting nuclear status of North Korea, and also reliance on direct diplomatic methods involving direct participants, primarily the main antagonists, North and South Korea. Also, as far as Russia and China, we don't accept involvement of South Korea or Japan in future into the global anti-missile system of the United States. Also, in practical terms, as far as the work on Peninsula, that's confirmed that as far as joint approaches, since 2015, special Russian-Chinese dialogue has been functioning on matters of security in Southeast Asia. At present, 6 full formal rounds of such dialogue has been held, several meetings of co-chairmen, contacts between foreign ministries, but also other departments, representatives of our countries were participating in this, and quite often we meet together, and frequency of our contacts is quite logical because the anxious situation in the region requires that we should work ahead of schedule, ahead of curve, particularly Korean Peninsula situation. We appreciate very highly the position of Peking as far as other big issue, which is Syria. Our cooperation with China as far as Syria on different international platforms has been quite unprecedented, basically. Let's enough to recall the fact that together 6 times Russia and China we blocked attempts to push through in Security Council anti-Syrian resolutions, which evidently could have been used to overthrow the legal government of the Syrian Republic. We are hoping that Chinese partners will continue their efforts to assist political settlement of the long-standing Syrian conflict and make their effort towards rebirth of Syria and the restoration of their economy. And of course, with our Chinese friends, we're not going to stop at what we achieved. Although I've just mentioned only the most, salient key points of our interaction on international arena. There are lots of other areas where we closely cooperate. Unfortunately, time being limited, I'm not able to speak about everything in detail. But in any case, we are determined. We have a mindset for taking our multilateral cooperation to new levels, to new frontiers, in the interests of fairness and equality on the international arena. And let me also mention that the coming summer, the visit by Chairman Xi Jinping will definitely provide extra impulse to our continuation of cooperation in the international arena. Thank you. Thank you, Vladimir. Making use of this opportunity, I would like to express on behalf of International Council of Affairs deep appreciation for you personally, and also appropriate relevant departments of Ministry of Foreign Affairs for their cooperation, for their attention to the materials we're preparing. Of course, we're hoping that our cooperation will continue to expand. Also, I'm very pleased to welcome, to greet at our conference, Mr. Alimov, the ambassador. I know you have a lot of work to do. 10 days from now, you're going to have a summit in Astana, which you can safely call historical summit in Astana, about expansion of Shanghai Organization. And of course, we are very appreciative that you've made the time to participate on conference. Also, Ambassador Alimov, welcome. Thank you, Tim Andreevich. First of all, I'd like to express my sincere appreciation for the invitation to take part in such an authoritative forum. I would like personally to thank Igor Alexeyevich Ivanov for his giving so much significance to the participation of Shanghai Cooperation Organization in this conference. Yes, in my view, it's not just relevant; it's quite unique. Because it makes it possible to discuss comprehensively very relevant burning issues of the international agenda in the context of the interaction between Russia and China, two great world powers that are located in such a wide region of Eurasia. Of course, the broad format dialogue between Russia and China, their comprehensive strategic partnership, it is reflected not only in terms of the state of affairs in the Eurasian region, but directly it does affect the overall world global level. We should not forget the fact that Russia and China have been a system forming states, founders of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. A week from now, on the 7th of June of 2017, will be marking the 15th anniversary of the adoption of the charter of SCO, which was founded in St. Petersburg. It's our main document, like our constitution. So based on that charter, this modern, unique model was built for regional cooperation, effective interstate interaction. It was underpinned, as you know, by this format, as you know, equal multilateral partnership, which is ensured by the taking all decisions strictly on the basis of consensus. The interaction within SCO framework, Russia and China, within SCO, Russia and China demonstrate very vividly how, in the interest of all and everyone, it's possible to correlate and connect interests of both of national and regional and basically global interests. So the history of Shanghai Organization, if you look at this through this prism, it teaches us that the path to success always lies through mutual understanding, through equality, through coordination. The closer the coordination, the deeper is the mutual understanding. The more strictly is the observance of equality, the stronger and more effective a partnership becomes within the framework of Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And here, Russia and China do demonstrate very vivid examples of this that were just mentioned just now. The common orientation point for the members of Shanghai Organization are the aims of consistent development. Naturally, first of all, it's the care, taking care of giving care to the security and stability across the space of Shanghai Organization as the guarantor for consistent development. So in this area, Shanghai Organization has been able to achieve quite substantive results. It is the stable situation in the region, responsibility of our association, Shanghai Organization, it makes it possible to focus attention at the projects of common regional development. In this connection, it's not by chance that Russia and China see Shanghai Organization as a key platform in terms of large-scale economic initiatives, among which you've just mentioned building economic belt road, and also naturally the greater Eurasian partnership. We are looking forward to the results of the visit Chairman Xi Jinping to Russia, and as we've just heard, it's going to be very serious set of results, which will influence or provide new impulse towards very serious interaction in the economic sphere. So the advantage of Shanghai Organization lies in the very fact that through equal dialogue, including among Russia and China, the organization makes it possible to seek and find optimal ways to resolve even most complex matters. So the sum total result of the maximum possible tying together of sovereign interests and common tasks, that's a strong aspect of organization. If there's no such quick coordination, and quite often is mentioned and written about by journalists, if it doesn't happen right away, it does mean it's a sign of stopping. It doesn't mean ceasing of efforts towards finding finally some common denominator. Quite the opposite is true. The effectiveness of the Shanghai model is not so much it's in terms of process, in terms of final, more than in terms of final result. It has a great incentive for joint creativity and flexibility. That comes from the appropriate provisions of the Charter and from the practice in terms of implementations of different mechanisms of Shanghai organizations, of which there are about 30 implementation mechanisms. As was mentioned by previous speakers, SHOS today is standing on the threshold of the accession to the organizations of very powerful, very authoritative, not just in the region but internationally, states of the Southeast Asia, India and Pakistan. They've already, and that's very important, they've already assumed practically all obligations under the Shanghai Organization memorandum that was signed in Tashkent. And all those obligations, commitments, are primarily related to the constructive engagement in the development and strengthening of the existing partnership model within SCO, with the accession of these internationally authoritative states, the SCOs, Shanghai organizations, from the regional forum focused on Central Asia. It will turn into trans-continental organizations with the area of responsibility spanning from Arctic to Indian Ocean. So from the Chinese Lumgan to the Russian Kaliningrad, from east to west. This is a huge territory. It's enough to remind you in this context that the member states among themselves combine more than 40% of the world population, and the overall gross product in terms of the buying power parity will be about 35 trillion US dollars, which is 1/4 of the world gross product. So I'd like to emphasize very special feature will be the fact that SCO will act as a platform for regional dialogue of 2 nuclear states too. This effectively half of the world nuclear club. And another detail, which indirectly was mentioned already too. As is known, in this region, we have about a dozen international associations, but only 2 of these are essentially universal, multi-purpose, namely Shanghai organizations and ASEAN. These 2 organizations, which have great, huge potential for cooperation, particularly due to having their own legislative norms practically across all directions of multilateral interactions. So transcontinental Shanghai Organization will make it possible to see this association as a connecting link, as a link between Asian, Pacific and Atlantic regions, countries of Southeast Asia and countries of Near East. And in this connection, great prospects are opening up towards further interaction between Shanghai Organization of 8 now with ASEAN Association of 10 countries in the area of economy and trade. One example that's important to cite very briefly, on the January 20th this year, came into force the agreement between Shanghai Organization countries to create favorable conditions for international truck shipments roads. It's a historical document. It took 8 years to prepare it with the support of the UN organizations, in particular ESCATA. A special feature of this document is its openness for accession of the countries not members of Shanghai organizations, and definitely many countries already are making applications to join up, because that will enable them to secure truck shipments from the east of China to Eastern Europe, which is huge territory. India and Pakistan, incidentally, they didn't wait their accession to Shanghai organizations. They already joined this document. Intensification of economic component in the activity of Shanghai organization will be the common trend in development of the entire organization. So accession of India and Pakistan definitely will even further expand the opportunities of shows in this area. And of course, we can imagine much work will be ahead of us, but we are prepared for this work, and we are confident that at the coming summit meeting, the leaders of our states will set the new tone for multilateral, multidimensional cooperation within Shanghai Organization, the way it's done by China and Russia in particular. Russia does demonstrate effective example of countering international terrorism, unlike it was ever done by international practice. China, in its own way, serves as a powerful engine towards economic development of global economies. So no doubt that this strategic tandem of Russia and China definitely will continue to drive the vector of world politics, as well as positive influence on the development of Shanghai organizations. What will happen next, we'll learn on the 9th of June in the second half of the day. Thank you. Thank you, Rashid Kubedinovich. I think all of you wish success in your not easy, but very important work for all of us. Now, let me give the floor to one of the perhaps most brightest theoreticians of international relations of the modern China, director of the Institute of International Relations, University of Tsinghua, Yanis Tuane. I do apologize. We exploit you very often. You were here in Moscow only months ago, but I do hope that you come here, you enjoy coming here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. I must apologize for not being able to speak Russian. So I will continue in Chinese, so please, those who need translation, use the headsets. Thank you very much for the opportunity given to me. I have learned a lot from the previous presentations. For example, that Mrs. Matviyenko, who is the Speaker of the Russian Parliament Upper House, said that the world is currently going through the process of change. And that was a very important observation, because were we in a state of stability and having the Russian-Chinese relations developing, these are different things, whether the world is stable or undergoing change. And so how are we to develop our relationships under these conditions? After the end of the Cold War, there was a transitional period of time in the development of our relations. And in other presentations, I also remember hearing about how we could improve the Russian-Chinese relations. So here we ought to think about what is the foundation that we have. And I heard from many speakers references to the concept of the New Silk Road, One Way, One Belt is in the foundation of the economic development and security, yes. But I do think that the core of our relationship is in two interest areas. Joint interests, the ones which coincide in between China and Russia, like, for example, combating terrorism, and mutually compatible interests, which is the second factor, because we do require Russian energy resources and Russian raw materials. Russia needs international currency for its development. So one should strengthen mutual interests and mutually compatible interests, and on such a basis build our relations. So the biggest changes in the international environment, which are they? I mean, the change in the international order, the kind of international order where the leading role was played by Western liberalism. And today the whole order of things is undergoing change. And it's not me saying, this is what we hear from the Western scholars, i.e. that the order, the world order, which was led by the United States, it should not be preserved. And like the European leaders are saying that the European security should not be placed in the hands of the Americans. So most probably one should not fight international terrorism primarily at the expense of the United States. This is not reliable. So this will invariably bring about its consequences. This is the first thing. And the center of the world is moving from the west to the east. The FT recently wrote about it, that the center for the global politics is being shifted towards Asia. Secondly, the liberal ideology, it is weakening in its positions. So what is the reason behind it? This is, an appearance of anti-liberalism, and specifically which undermines the ideological backbone of the modern world. And this is the kind of ideology which has appeared from within the West, and therefore having this center of international politics and economics moving gradually towards Asia, because the GDP in Asia is now exceeds the GDP in America and Europe, and that was why the economic leadership of America is currently being doubted. Now, what Russia and China and the rest of the nations are facing, because right now the United States is no longer being the globalization leader defining the world order. So this is the kind of change, this is uncertainty related to the Trump administration. So this is the third. And during the past decades, we see that whatever order definition is there, it is being prescribed not by the future needs, but the need to preserve the already established world order, and various uncertainties that we have to cope with, like, for example, with Taiwan, whereby no consistent policies in place, and so sometimes the changes in policies are being resolved based on a single leader's emotions rather than a well thought out international affairs process. So this kind of an uncertainty will be detrimental to our mutual interests and the interests which are compatible to each other between our two countries. And that is why this is something that one has to see very clearly. China and Russia, I believe that the clarity of the situation is that our relations with the G7 won't change, because they will continue being critical both of China and Russia, and that is why Russia and China do live through the structural contradictions with the West, and these are not ideological contradictions, nor these are the changes coming from the change of leadership in our countries. And the last point, we are facing the world which is undergoing change, and therefore the foundation underneath our relationships are changing. And Mr. Morgulov made a reference to this. We ought to continue strengthening the trust between our countries, and Mrs. Matvienko also stated that mutual trust is the core element, although there is a bit of a discrepancy between the politicians and the scientists, because the politicians believe that the most important thing is trust, because the trust is the backbone, and the consequence of trust is friendship. But where this trust will come from, I personally think that first is cooperation, and trust comes second, rather than first trust and second cooperation. The result of our today's trust is the cooperation in the military defense area, holding of military exercises. Without this kind of cooperation, there wouldn't be trust. Now, what is the basis of cooperation? Mutual interest and mutually compatible, complementing interests, and that is why we need to strengthen this foundation, and thus strengthen cooperation and trust. Therefore, the basis of such a cooperation is in the kind of strategic cooperation which are reliant upon defense cooperation, and therefore, well, one certainly also has to develop trade and economic relations, but moreover, one has to develop our defense cooperation. Now, the issue of Syria, the issue of Korean Peninsula, and I very much agree to what Mr. Margulov mentioned, that one has to develop an effective dialogue which will be of a preemptive nature in these issues, rather than trying to catch up with the string of events. And that is why the issue of Syria, the issue of Korean Peninsula, and the issue of Iran here as well. And the most important challenge that our strategic cooperation faces is the threat and the pressure from the United States. Our relations between China and the United States, and here one definitely has to take into account this peculiarity of the Trump administration, and the uncertainties that are wrought within, and its difference from the previous U.S. administrations, and that is one should not trust this administration, because he may say one thing and do a totally different thing. And that is why we basically have a lot of areas where we may cooperate and further expand this mutual cooperation. That is why I would like to underscore defense cooperation and trade economic cooperation. That is the order of appearance. Thank you very much, Professor Yatsuching. Now, please let me pass the microphone over to the Army General and the Ambassador Vyacheslav Trubnikov. Andrei Vladimirovich, thank you very much. I'm very appreciative for having this third honor of attending this very representative forum at which we are discussing the issues of cooperation between our two countries. Igor Vladimirovich, who left so broadly, in such major touches, depicted the current global situation that it's very difficult to step outside of its frame. And therefore I would like to consider certain peculiar things which I find closer to me due to my previous responsibilities, amongst other things, as well as me working as ambassador to India. But I will start from the basic thing. All of the previous speakers unanimously acknowledged that the world is changing. And undoubtedly, we are living now through a transitional period from a bipolar world towards a polycentric world, as the deceased academician Primakov used to say, and whose views views as that of my senior comrade I fully share. And this world is following the trail which is very difficult to predict today. The forecast is something that is extremely difficult to do because the world has become more complex. New challenges and threats have appeared, the ones that we already heard here mentioned earlier. The month of May was filled with quite a number of international events. Putting aside the sad news of the terrorist events, I would like to mention such an important component of the international affairs environment as, sorry for being vulgar, looking at the parade of the new US president in Europe, be it attending the NATO events on the European Union events, as well as the parade of what was taking place in the Middle East and in the Arab countries. But so what can I say? Unfortunately, all of such events, one way or another, were wrought with the reverberations of the last century's mentality. Yes, indeed. The US president showed himself up being a very successful traveling salesman, and again, I guess, going back home, once again, sorry for being vulgar, he will beat himself in the bosom and will say, look guys, I'm one of you. Why do you deal with me like this? Why do you treat me this way? And again, the defense industry will again receive a lot of financial investments and a huge book of orders, and the development of things in the United States will follow its usual course. The system will revert back to what it always used to be. And so against this backdrop, 2 days looked extremely unique. I mean, May 14th, 15th in Beijing, where one heard totally different views, the ones which were aimed at the future, where one could hear an eloquent expression of the strategic mindset amongst the participants of this forum. The people who were looking into the future, who were daring to consider the new architecture of security, the new world architecture. And undoubtedly, nobody has the right to say that everything will develop as we want it. Nothing like it. The world is developing in a dialectical way. Globalization, regionalization of the international relations is taking place simultaneously. Competition and cooperation between very different countries, different entities and people, I'm sorry to say, is also happening simultaneously, complementing each other, at times contradicting each other, but that is life. And it seems to me that the people who gathered in Beijing want to see a new world. Yes, somehow the idea which our Chinese colleagues have refreshed, the Silk Route idea. The idea is centuries old, and it worked. But those were caravan trails. Now, in terms of what it is these days, the idea of one way, one belt, it means a colossal restructuring, reorganization of not only economic relations on this huge Eurasian landmass. This is something which requires a change in mindset, an enormous effort to change the infrastructure, whereas for the camel caravans, a river represented a water fording obstacle. Then for the railroad routes, for the highways and pipelines, for the power grid, this river creates an opportunity of building new terminals, new townships, creating new employment, creating a new impetus, and developing an individual state or nations. Now, what follows what is another big question. To build a new infrastructure in an environment, stability is certainly much simpler, and moreover, stability guarantees quite fast-paced infrastructural development, very quick investment payback, but at the same time, investments and infrastructure development provides for a more stable living of human beings, more stable relationships, a higher quality of life. And again here we note the elements of the very same dialectics. And I suppose I would very much like to agree to my immediate neighbor on my right, who raised the issue of trust. Trust as a cornerstone in any cooperation, in any development, and it seems to me that he was very correct in underscoring that trust is the result of cooperation, without doubt. Trust cannot be decreed. Trust cannot be declared. Trust is born only out of joint work, shoulder to shoulder, and the more difficult this work is, the stronger is trust, the deeper is understanding of mutual interests. However, cooperation is something that is brought about by one very important factor, which should have its rightful place in the construction of our great Eurasian interaction, which is transparency of intentions, transparency of an intention to build something. What for? And this is exceptionally important in order to avoid any wrong interpretation, misinterpretation by your neighbor of the intentions of your friends and your partners and neighbors. And that is why the transparency of intent is a very big, serious problem, upon which, by the way, today's cooperation will be developing within such formats as the Shanghai Organization for Cooperation. I wish it very success. And similar organizations are called upon to deepen trust between the members of such organizations. Yes, indeed. Two neighboring states are expected to join as member in South Asia India and Pakistan. And I guess that one doesn't have to convince you particularly that the relations between them are far from being easy. These relations are being spoiled, have been spoiled since 1997 by an existence of serious territorial disputes, blood-shedding events of 1948, which is the separation of Hindustan to India and Pakistan. And this trust, it has been undermined over the decades of mutual suspicions, hostilities, military conflicts. And so the task of the Shanghai Organization for Cooperation is to ensure having such a situation whereby these two countries, these two participants in the organization could find a path towards resolving their contradictions, their mutual problems, mutual claims. Without it, it will be an extremely difficult job to develop this system of Indo-Pacific security, because we are not only talking about the Silk Route, not only about one way, one belt, but we also are talking about the marine Silk Route of the 21st century, and this is the Indian Ocean. We are talking about there being a very brilliant idea of the Chinese-Pakistani economic corridor, which takes China through the Kwadar port into the Indian port and also through Karachi. And this is the idea which will provide a very substantial incentive towards the development of economic cooperation, the regional security, but may have in it a threat of the growth of mutual distrust, because the strategic interests, they ought to be digested, chewed out in such a way so that the counterparty would not take it as a deterrent to its interest in terms of what is happening on the side of its neighbor. And so I believe that the Shanghai Organization for Cooperation is called upon to alleviate the kind of complexities that we currently see in the relations between India and Pakistan, the contradictions whereby are also reflected upon the kind of complexities that India has with China. I mean, the territorial issue. But one should not think that India is the kind of nation which may not participate in the new architecture of the Indo-Pacific security. This would have been an enormous detriment to the whole peace system of peace in the region, and to approach, I believe, the wrong decision on the part of the Indian government to participate in the past forum, to approach it from the position, well, I mean, if they didn't want to, all right, this is a wrong approach. Both Russia and China ought to act in such a way so as to convince India to participate in such a common process, and in no way to allow the West and America in the first place to push India into the corner, into the kind of a fenced-in area that the United States is trying to build around China. This is a very serious thing. I believe that neither China nor Russia can be interested in having India lean towards the United States. That is why I am placing a lot of hope upon the Shanghai Organization for Cooperation. The potential of this very serious organization, which may take the cooperation within the Eurasian space into a bigger format without staying content with what we might be having today or the day after tomorrow. So I suppose that today, and Oleg Mihailovich, when he was speaking about the cooperation in building the power circle, this is an exceptionally important endeavor. And so it seems to me that not only the countries which have been mentioned by way of potential participants in this power circle project, but we'll also bear in mind such countries as in the Central Asian countries, which may not be staying aside from this process. But let us take a look at Afghanistan. During the period of the Silk Route ages, Afghanistan was a prospering nation through the fact of being located in the center of all of the commercial routes. So the Afghanistan's transit status provided it with great opportunities. Now, what is now happening? Afghanistan is being torn apart by internal instability. So what one can do, and as it seems to me, something that we heard people talking in Beijing is one of the trajectories which must be aimed at involving Afghanistan into the project. And China, by the way, is very successfully dealing with it, into the process of economic cooperation. When Afghanistan and the embattled warlords will finally see that peace is coming to their native land, and the foreign troops will disappear. And that is a very important understanding that was reached in Beijing. Not only trade and economic and infrastructural problems will have to be dealt with. First and foremost, the issue of security will have to be resolved. And so these two processes of ensuring security and prosperity are inextricably related to each other. And that is exactly what our president spoke about in Beijing. And I do say that the tone which was set by the forum, one belt, one way, the tone of the discussions which took place there, and the attempt to find a solution to complex issues through diplomatic negotiations, like, for example, let's take a look at the very last agreement between China and Vietnam, pertaining to the future negotiations about joint patrolling of the fishing areas in the Bay of Tianjin. These are specific steps which exactly provide for an appearance of trust in the relationships between the two nations, and naturally the transparency in the intentions that both sides have. And so it seems to me that following this particular path, which leads to a maximum engagement of all of the nations existing on this vast Eurasian space, along this path is where we might encounter success. Not today, not tomorrow, but this is the right way. This is not the path into the past. These are not the Cold War times resounding. This is a totally different look at the changing world, and we understand that the world is changing, although some do not understand it or do not want to understand it. But God help them. Thank you. Thank you, Vyacheslav Ivanovich. You have touched upon some very important issue, and one should definitely believe the ability of the countries and the experts in different communities to discuss very acute and quite often not very pleasant issues, unresolved issues, and maybe even mutual claims and grievances. And this is an indication of an existence of stability and trust in the kind of relations that so far have been achieved. And so just, being a moderator and being entitled to a bit of a self-promotion, I would like to draw the attention of all of the participants that just recently a report was published, which was prepared by the Russian International Affairs Councils together with the Institute of the Far East and together with our colleagues from China, specifically with the Fudan University group headed by Professor Jia Huashen, our all-time friend and partner, about the state of the Chinese-Russian relations this year. And I believe this is just an example of the way one can and should identify issues without abandoning issues which are yet unresolved, without turning one's back to the problems and the tasks that still require attention and effort. And I'm very grateful to the director of the Institute of the Far East of the Russian Academy of Sciences, Sergei Luzyanin, who not only was one of the authors but also the locomotive behind this project. And so it's a great pleasure for me to give him the floor now. Please, Sergei. Thank you. Thank you, Andrei Vadimovich. Dear colleagues and dear friends, yes, indeed, there took place the publication of the third report, Russian-Chinese Relations 2017 model. 9 Russian experts and 9 Chinese experts, so it's an analytical cross-section covering global issues, regional issues. This is a look at various conclusions and recommendations and guidelines to the leadership of both countries and the monitoring part. It's a small brochure, very compact, but it has a colossal effort put into it, and most importantly that it was being born through a very difficult process. Specifically, this is the narrowly Russian-Chinese vision. Not everything dovetails, but most of it, 90%, is where we were able to reach a common language, and it expresses a very valuable expert thinking. Now, back to this session. I would suggest to voice, maybe 3 or 5 statements just to identify what the future discourse or discussion could be. The first one is about the role of China and Russia in maintaining strategic stability and security. This is a very big topic, a very complex topic, multifaceted one, and a political foundation to it is well known. This is the joint statement by Mr. Putin and Mr. Xi Jinping dated June 25, 2016, quite possibly during the July meetings between our leaders. This is the topic which will be further elaborated. And so in this slide I would mention just 3 points of interpretation. The first one, peculiarity. It's quite obvious because the Russian-Chinese influence over the global security is happening not from the classical format of an alliance of some sort, but from the format of a strategic partnership. But at the same time, the security agenda, the agenda of this global security and the regional security, is not smaller than the agendas of the classic political military alliances. It's a flexible one. It is evolving. It is being further added with other issues. It contains practically all of the aspects aspects. There are military marine exercises are taking place. That was the second peculiarity, is that this format, the Russian-Chinese strategic format, it is self-sufficient. It does not, I believe, directly depend upon the worsening or the improvement, let's say, conditionally, of the Sino-US or Sino-Russian or Japanese or any pairs of this sort, etc. Although, let's not be deceiving ourselves. During the past 5 years, and this Western anti-Russian hysteria and this sanctional pressures, amongst other things, certainly have intensified the process of Russia and China coming closer to each other. But I believe that if it wasn't for that, the Russian-Chinese format as a self-sufficient unit within the global security and stability system would have done without it. And the third peculiarity is of a principally important one in this kind of an expression of statement. Structurally, within this idea of Russian-Chinese influence over the stability and security, there are two obvious components. The first obvious component is a military strategic one where Russia naturally has an absolute advantage, and the second component is the economic investment, technological, financial component where naturally China is having a dominant place. So there are two complementing components, and what is principally important is that there is no strategic contradiction between these two. This is very important to know, because specifically within this component there is a certain correlation, adjoining, or some sort of fusion, you name it, whatever you like. The military, strategic, and economic, they're not static. They are continuously evolving, and that is where comes where this usual, wording comes in terms of the Chinese saying, back to back. So it has a very deep meaning in it. Now, the second statement about the role of the Chinese-Russian partnership, it is also something that this brochure is talking about. Here is the copy for you. It was put out on the tables there. Maybe there aren't any more left. Actually, yes, three publications: the Chinese, Russian, and English language publications. So that makes it more valuable. So the second statement about the role of the Russian-Chinese partnership, in the sense of its effect over the global, management institutions. On the one hand, the classic, Russia and China are interested in either preserving or reforming the old global management institutions, in the first place, like the UN Security Council, then the right of veto institution. Although, as we know, China very powerfully is changing the system of quotas in the World Bank in favor of major emerging economies as well as itself, and etc., etc. But this trend does feed into the preservation and the reforming of this quote-unquote old system of international management and governance which appeared after the Second World War, but also right in front of our eyes. There's not an alternative, but a complementing regional governance institutions that are emerging, which gradually turn into the global one. During the past 15 years, we were witnessing the way the Shanghai Organization of Cooperation appeared, and the G8, and maybe even G9, whereby Iran may join this group, because Iran is something that could be very effectively from the global viewpoints, as well as for the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Now BRICS, and finally the One Belt initiative, and so the second forum was announced to take place in Beijing in the future. So consequently, we are seeing that there is a constant emergence of informal yet partially institutionalized, like in the in the person of the Shanghai Organization of Cooperation, of different projects, different initiatives, which definitely point to a gradual development of global regional projects of economic cooperation. Now, this third statement is the security agenda. The regional one, I'm not going to disclose it because it is obvious, different challenges, the strength of different threats grow, the responsibility, the accountability do also grow. And there's a separate point about strengthening, the law enforcement and defense components. There is also a topic of separate cooperation in the cybersecurity area, etc. Now, the fourth topic. Also, very briefly, certain general methodological and political principles in the Russian-Chinese trade and economic cooperation, which will be touched upon in detail tomorrow. And so this report, this brochure, also in a very detailed way describes the strong and weak and new options. Let me not elaborate upon it. Just a certain general methodology, which is related to how one could change this structure, which is very hot at the top in politics and very cold at the bottom in the economics. So this chart, this pyramid, has been around for quite some time, so it hasn't yet been changed in the Russian-Chinese trade and economic relations. So there's a whole mass of reasons as to why, and I guess this is something that will be considered tomorrow in detail. But as a political premise, I would word it in the following way, that certainly both sides must be guided by a rational compromise, by a synthesis of political rationale and commercial benefit. But today, as a rule, the latter, the commercial benefit, is something that absolutely dominates. So it's either that the commercial benefit is not going to happen soon, in some distant future, or it responds only to the interests of one party 100%. So if that is the case, then the project is shelved or delayed or postponed. So possibly there has to be a compromise. There has to be a synthesis between the political rationale and the commercial benefit. This is a very difficult thing to achieve, but quite obviously, if the project is worth over $1 million, this is not only commerce and trade, this is also geopolitics. So one second thing from this economic set of topics, do it say, this combination, this adjoining of the Eurasian Economic Union and the economic project of the Silk Route. This is not only the Russian transit, this is not only transportation, these are not only corridors. Most probably, might be a most important thing, is the possibility to launch a joint Russian-Chinese, joint Chinese-Russian Kazakh, with the participation of Belarus, of various joint manufacturing projects, of various machinery and other stuff. So this is a qualitatively new discourse, but this is something that I'm sure people will talk about tomorrow. And now, concluding the last statement, what is Russia and China geopolitically, globally? I believe that Russia and China today, under these conditions of a growing instability in the international relations, the growing unpredictability and conflict, is a newly forming center of power, but not in the classical bipolar understanding of it like it was in the past era, US and Soviet Union. But this is the kind of a center which so far not becoming this classic pole formally and officially. It is not aimed at third countries or at any third parties, be it the West or the United States or any, but at the same time, very much clearly, one of the objectives of this linkage, Russia and China, is to develop a Eurasian independent, let me emphasize, independent from be it European or American or Western political, ideological influence, kind of Eurasian space. So this is a very big topic. It has already been mentioned today. And so in the foundation of this gigantic Eurasian space is the core, Russia and China, which is based upon strategic partnership and cooperation. Thank you. Thank you, Sergei Gennadievich. Our next speaker, Sergei Mikhailovich Rogov, who is representing Russian Academy of Sciences Institute of USA in Canada. Sergei Mikhailovich, I've got a question to you. On multiple occasions we heard here American factor being mentioned, but the American factor, primarily during this panel, was referred to as an additional risk factor, as additional factor of uncertainty, maybe even some sort of a threat, both to Russia as well as to China. Well, nevertheless, do you believe that there is a possibility to achieve stability in such a Russian-Chinese-American triangle? Is there any possibility, for multilateral or trilateral cooperation in as far as such issues are concerned as North Korea, Afghanistan, maybe other problems? And can we say that the factor is only negative, or it may also contain certain positive elements in it? Thank you, Andrei Vladimirovich. Well, quite naturally, I'm not an expert about China, but I, like you asked me, will speak about the Russian-Chinese-American triangle. where I feel some very important and serious events are taking place. Yes, indeed, there is a potential for a positive cooperation, including the Korean issue, Afghan issue, Syrian issue. But nevertheless, I would like to touch upon the points which personally make me feel concerned. And so, bearing in mind that there's not much time given in a very concise and very provocative way, I would like and mention a few points. Well, first of all, the concept of triangle itself emerged during the Cold War era, and the Nixon administration used this concept so that through the normalization of relations with the People's Republic of China to strengthen its pressure upon the Soviet Union. To a certain extent, that is exactly what happened, although the ensuing normalization of our relations with China changed things around. During the last year's election campaign, this issue again surfaced in the political debate. And I must say and remind us that already throughout several years, the United States, and I'm talking about the military political aspect, effectively are conducting the policy of a double containment for both Russia and China. And whereas in the case of China, these aspects in many ways are balanced by joint economic interests, in the Russian-American relations, this factor is very small, and the Russian-American relations in many ways have acquired the nature of the new Cold War, although not fully being like the older model was. So in the course of the election campaign, Mr. Trump raised it directly, saying that America won't have enough resources to continue this double containment, and mentioned this kind of statement, which was described as the Kissinger the other way around, which was about using Russia to contain China. In the first place, not to allow for the Russian-Chinese alliance to be established, to which will counteract to the United States activities, to have Russia take up a neutral position and maybe even support America in containing China. But at the same time, in relationship to China, Trump came out with open threats which were about the economic aspects, like his promises to dramatically raise the tariffs for the Chinese goods, as well as the military threats. But after Trump took up the office, the expectations that there have been that Trump would follow his pre-election rhetoric so far are not coming true. And I believe that this can be explained by two things. First of all, in the United States, we see a very powerful and unprecedented anti-Russian campaign continuing, and Trump feels this pressure and is forced in one way or another to take heed, because this is the campaign which not only actively involves the Democratic Party, but more and more the Republicans, is threatening their current American presence with some very serious consequences all the way to impeachment, although it's very much premature to talk about it. But in as far as China is concerned, then quite unexpected, I believe, is such a demonstrative readiness of Trump to cooperate with China. And it was no accident that the summit meeting between the leaders of two countries very quickly took place, while the meeting between Putin and Trump so far has not occurred. And the possibility of such a meeting continues to look difficult and uncertain. There haven't been any serious economic sanctions against China, contrary to what Mr. Trump promised. Why? I believe that in the first place, this is explained by the fact that North Korea has presented Mr. Trump with a first very important foreign political crisis. And it is quite obvious that the Trump administration, while demonstrating readiness to cooperate with China, demands of China to undertake the strongest possible pressure upon Pyongyang in order to stop the Korean nuclear missile program. Well, I'm not going to deepen into this issue because here one finds a lot of details, but I will just express a certain assumption that irrespective of the way the North Korean issue is resolved, because one should not rule out the military option here, I would say that the problems that one finds in the Sino-American relations will gradually be moving to the forefront. I read a lot of American publications about the potential for the American-Chinese war. There's a lot being written about it, but as strange as it may sound, there are no articles almost which consider the possibility of American-Russian war. I mean, there are certain exceptions like the RAND Corporation and a few others, but the scenario of hostilities against China have almost completely took the expert community up, and the main emphasis is being put upon undermining the potential on the part of China to project its force beyond the borders of its immediate areas of interest, beyond the so-called first line of islands, so to say. And the majority of such scenarios are putting an emphasis upon the economic blockade of China in order to cut China from the sources of energy, and even if China would create strategic reserves, in 2.5 months China would find itself in a situation of energy catastrophe. And of course, in these statements that I am referring to, there are a lot of speculatory imagination. Not everything should be taken seriously, but nevertheless, Trump administration confirmed that the main emphasis is going to be put in its defense policy upon the Pacific area, and in the first place to contain China. And during the last few days, I'm again hearing this news that the American Navy will, in a demonstrative way, ignore the territorial claims that China has in the South China Sea, not paying attention to the territorial borders that the Chinese government identifies, or the territorial waters or the economic zone. And I would like to say a few more words about the changes in the military and strategic area, which indeed create common threats and concerns for both China and Russia. One of them is related to the anti-missile defense. I already mentioned the provocative activities by the Korean Democratic Republic, and quite obviously that these activities are being utilized by the United States for the purpose of expanding its anti-missile defense system. But let me remind you that the main base of anti-missile defense the United States have is located in Alaska. Just now, the United States have reactivated the interceptor missile base hut in South Korea, and there have also been recent reports that Japan is considering the possibility of deploying in its territory the anti-missile defense base EGC Shore. Japan, as is known, has already bought several installations of the marine-based anti-missile defense and is involved itself in the development of the new generation SM-3 interceptor missile, which is SM-3 Block 2A. But for the first time, there is an issue of deploying a land-based anti-missile defense similar to the one that the Americans deployed in Romania and are planning to deploy in Poland in 2018. And this is a very serious thing which, in my mind, requires some very confidential Russian-Chinese consultations, because to a larger extent, I would even say, what the Americans are currently doing creates a threat to the Chinese nuclear deterrence. And here, there is a second point from the military strategic area which I wanted to note. Well, as you know, in the United States, there is a free-for-all propaganda campaign blaming Russia that it has violated the agreement on the intermediate and short-distance missile. Why this particular agreement in the United States is under a threat. But at the same time, one must mention that also within the American expert community, as well as in the American Pacific Command, there is an issue being raised that the United States need the intermediate distance missiles in the Pacific against China. The kind of missiles which would enable the United States to deal blow upon the artificial islands in the South China Sea, as well as at the military and economic Chinese facilities located basically in the territory of China itself. Usually, the SALT problems are being viewed as the threat of the American intermediate distance missiles being deployed in Poland and Romania. But as far as China is concerned, this problem turns out to be even more serious. And the last thing, in spring this year, several months ago, it was announced that the United States completed the upgrading of the warheads for the submarine-based nuclear missiles, a higher class for D5 missiles. And this upgrading enabled them to dramatically increase the precision of these warheads and their capability to penetrate the targets beyond the defense line. And it means that in the United States, out of 14 strategic submarines, 8 of them are based in the Pacific, and 6 of them are constantly patrolling the areas which are quite close to the People's Republic of China. And each of such submarines has 20 D5 missile launchers, which in a single launch could, for example, target 300 points, whereas in the past it was believed that just to hit one target you needed just to have one Continental MX and 2 warheads per one target. Here we are looking at a potential of 1 warhead per 1 target. Well, in any case, this is the problem which represents a very considerable threat to China. Based on the assessment, although there are no official views that China doesn't enunciate it. The number of the delivery means that China is not sufficient. It is believed that China doesn't have more than 300 warheads and about 100 or 150 vehicles to deliver that. And so there comes up a very realistic potential of the U.S. blow against China, which will completely disarm China, as well as the anti-missile defense to stop whatever is left, and there's not going to be much left. And that is also a challenge to us. Well, in our case, firstly, we've got a much more powerful strategic nuclear missile potential compared to the United States, in excess of 400 vehicles, missile kind of delivery vehicles, without counting in heavy bombers. We have a system of early warning about nuclear attack, something that China doesn't have. And our missile air force are in a state of constant readiness. We can launch our missiles within several minutes, while China, as is known, adheres to the policy of not being the first one to apply. I mean, whereas Russia can respond to American attack in a counter blow, China effectively doesn't have such a possibility. I understand that I spoke about some very difficult and very unpleasant things, considering in this assumptive way the worst case scenario, and most probably such scenarios will never happen. I don't think that there will be a nuclear war between Russia and the United States, or between China and the United States. But nevertheless, possibility to draw up such a scenario, I feel, requires a very serious dialogue between Moscow and China to begin on these very delicate issues. Thank you, Sergei Mikhailovich. I believe that your presentation anticipates a certain response from the people who have experience of working in the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation. So it is very pleasant for me to say that here on this panel right now we have Yevgeny Buzhinsky, who is Lieutenant General, Chairman of the Peer Center Council. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrei Vladimirovich. In my very brief speech, I'd like to cover, of course, the matters of military cooperation between Russia and China that was already mentioned in the previous speeches. It's a well-known fact that the maturity of bilateral relations basically is driven by the level of the military cooperation. In the case of the aggravation of bilateral relations, the first one to suffer is cooperation in military matters, which is what we witness as far as our relations with the United States or European countries, the NATO countries. So speaking of, as far as the cooperation between Russia and China on military matters, I'd like to cite one particular fact. At the end of March, the State Commission on Monitoring Economic Matters and Matters of Security with regard in relations between the United States and China, that's the commission is a bipartisan consultative department on China under the Congress of the United States. They published a report entitled "Military Relations Between Russia and China onto a high level." In particular, it notes that Russia and China, having declared the slogan in 1996, the coordinated strategic partnership, have been consistent in implementing their plans in developing military technical cooperations, taking it to a new strategic level. According to the authors of the report, interaction between Russia and China at present is characterized by an unprecedented high level of scale and quality. Stepping away from this report, I need to say that our relations have been developing across three areas. I'm referring to military cooperations, that's specifically conducting military exercises, contacts of the top leadership of the military, and military and technical cooperation. Very briefly on all those areas. In 2016, for the first time, the sides conducted army and general staff exercise of missile armies called in 2016. I need to say that the process of our interaction on the matters of anti-missile defense that was mentioned by Sergei Nikolaevich, our positions with China quite identical. Both Russia and China are countering the plans of the United States to create global system of anti-missile defense, global system with its regional components in Europe, Asian Pacific region, and Middle East. And so following the paths of improving the strategic offensive weapons, not in terms of overcoming the anti-missile defense systems. So 15 years ago, we started the process of interaction with China on the matters of anti-missile defense, and last year we reached the point of conducting joint commands, general staff exercises. The second element of our cooperation on this set of topics, also dialogue, which goes back to more than 10 years, more than 15 years, on the matters of modeling, simulating non-strategic anti-missile systems. And last year also saw the annual bilateral marine exercise in 2016 military Navy cooperation in the territory of Chinese Republic. Also, our armed forces were very actively engaged in terms of participation in the exercise of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Those exercises also annual exercise they conduct in the territory of the countries members of Shanghai Organization. Last year, such exercises were conducted in the territory of Kyrgyzia. But of course, the basis of the countries and the forces and the means provided for such exercises came from, naturally, elements of the armed forces of the Russian Federation and China People's Republic. Also last year, so in the format of shows, the joint shooting exercise in the territory of China. As for exchange of visits of the top leadership of top command of Russian and Chinese military force last year, saw 22 visits, starting from the Minister of Defense, head of general staff, heads of general staff, commanders-in-chief of different kinds of armed forces. And I need to say that one of the main topics within the framework of this exchange was exchange of experience and discussion of matters of reforming armed forces. It's an open secret that both Russian Federation and the Chinese People's Republic are conducting reforming of their armed forces, both in terms of organization, optimizing the numbers of armed force, optimizing the structure of units and divisions and kinds and types of armed forces, and also re-equipment, refitting, technical refitting of their armed forces. China has recently paid more attention to giving high priority to improving and upgrading primarily Air Force and Navy forces. New elements are given priority in terms of building air carrier groups in the Navy, in which they've made quite a big progress. First, based on what Russian Federation had provided, and then now that China People's Republic are already creating their own. They've just unveiled their own carrier, and they're not, as far as I know, they're not going to stop this. Here are a few words about military technical cooperation of our countries. I need to say that Americans are quite right. Our military technical cooperation has come onto a new level. As an example, both Americans, and it's an open secret, the two contracts First contract is for shipments of to China of Russian fighter jets, Su-35 planes that of the generation A4++. Very good aircraft, which has proven effectiveness in, among other things, during the Syrian operation. According to the estimates, and the shipments of those planes started December last year. The Americans are very much concerned. The leadership of the United States and the authors of the report I mentioned, they say directly that China having such type of aircraft and possible contribution of those shipments towards developing their own aviation systems, that might undermine the superiority of the United States in the area of Pacific Ocean. Asian Pacific Ocean region. Second, it was finalized finally the contract to ship to China the anti-aircraft guns S-400. China became the first country to receive such shipments of such anti-air guns complexes, which is not something that China's neighbors are encouraged by. In particular, the United States and Japan are not encouraged by this, because they feel that having such systems will not only strengthen the China's anti-aircraft system, but also will pose a threat to air forces of United States, Taiwan, and Japan. Overall, the bilateral plan of military cooperation between armed forces Russia and China amounted to more than 40 events. As far as the military security and strategic stability, one needs to also to note the agreement of the positions of our countries as far as the non-proliferation. I already mentioned anti-missile defense and also militarization of outer space, where Russia and China are acting on the same platform, on the same position. To conclude my presentation, I'd like to note that the authors of this report, which I referred to, in spite of the fairly alarmist tone of the main content of the report, they actually come to a fairly unexpected surprise conclusion, saying that because the differences in the area of military policy and traditional mutual distrust, at present there's practically no grounds for the emergence of allied type of relations, which in the case of the event of attack on one country, the other country would provide assistance in the form of mutual defense. I want to repeat today what I was saying last year. Perhaps the time has come, or will come soon, when the sides will remember the relations they used to have back in the 1950s of the last century, and might raise the level of their relations, maybe not to the full-fledged strategic military cooperation, but with some elements first of mutual allied type relations, might introduce them into their bilateral relations. And finally, last thing I want to say is that Russia and China, I think they should make more effort towards developing military component within the framework of Shanghai Organization for Cooperation, among other things in terms of institutionalizing formulation documents of the organizations. Thank you. Thank you, Evgeny Petrovich. I'd like to say that since we've started our work rather behind the schedule, organizers gave me the opportunity to extend our session for another half hour, so we'll be able to hear all the speakers. So let me give the floor to our long-standing friend and partner, director of the Institute of Russia, Eastern Europe and Central Asia of the Chinese Academy of Public Sciences in Taiwan. Let me congratulate our colleagues from the Academy, from the Chinese Academy of Public Sciences, with their significant anniversary quite recently. I attended the celebration of the 40th anniversary of the Academy. The gift we owe you a gift. Let me remind you that last summer, between Russian Council for International Affairs and the Academy, in the presence of the leaders of the countries, agreement was signed on cooperation, and we do know that as soon as as recently as March this year, in the format of academy, a council was set up on the matters of strategic cooperation between Russia and China. I think it's very important and very timely decision, and I'm hoping that we'll be actively engaging with this new division of the Chinese Academy of Social Science. Please. Thank you very much. Good day, good friends. I'm very happy that again I have the honor of speaking from this floor. I took part in this conference since the very first conference. When I was preparing my speech, I found it rather difficult to decide what I'm going to say at this conference. Finally, I decided to express my point of view on three particular considerations. First of all, I want to congratulate on the 60th anniversary of setting up the Society for Russian-Chinese Friendship. It's very important festivity and celebration. I want to express my particular respect and appreciation for all those who for many years have worked in this society, who in all situations, no matter what was happening in our history, were confident of the prospects of our relations. Many thanks to them. Now, specifically, my statements. First, about the sustained character of Russian-Chinese relations. This matter came up with me because during the election campaign in the United States and after the election of President Trump, in his speeches regarding the American-Russian relations and American-Chinese relations, a strong reaction in the media was evoked by the news that the United States appeared to be capable of driving a wedge between Russia and China. This reaction, not only in the Chinese or Russian media, I often thought about this process. Are relations so fragile as that? Early in the century, some Chinese had a point of view that relations between China and Russia and the United States would be better off to have those relations as three-party rather than three triangle type relations. Parallel development of Russian-Chinese relations and Chinese-American relationships, American-Russian relationships, that might be more realistic, more optimal in terms of results to achieve. But here it appeared that those relationships would seem to be in the shape of triangle, no confrontations. So in this event, what could we do? Everybody's saying that the world is changing, that the style of behavior of the powers is changing too. But as far as I'm concerned, some things are not changing. That's the basis for a relationship between Russia and China. I'm certain that all the colleagues from China and Russia, no matter what kind of spiritual orientation they have, maybe towards the West, towards China, but as long as they do love their motherland, as long as they do love their countries, they need to preserve Russian-Chinese relationships. So, because it's only the preservation of relationship will ensure our long-term national strategic interests, not only national ones. That's the first statement of mine. Second, the fact that Russian-Chinese relationships are the basis for the stability in the region of Eurasia. The 1/4 century of successful development of Russian-Chinese relationship not only provided favorable conditions for national development of our countries, but also favorable conditions for the stability in the region, Eurasia, especially in Central Asia. For many years, to be honest, there was a concerns in Russia about China's presence in Central Asia. I should think our Russian friends might recall that the presence of China in Central Asia actually plays a positive role, because we, just like Russia, we are interested in stability, stable development of this region. Central Asia, not only theoretical border of safety for Russia, but also its western border of safety for China. And China's presence helps towards positive process in this post-Soviet space. We're supporting this process, especially over the last 2 years. Back in 2015 in May, the joint declaration between Russia and China about the correlation of two projects, the construction of Eurasian Economic Union and the economic belt of Silk Road. Also, the joint declaration of June 25th last year about the possible construction of Eurasian comprehensive partnership. And as far as Russia, according to Russian terminology, it's a big Russian, great Russian partnership. In theory, it's a grandiose, grand initiative project. Both of these declarations, they mentioned one very important point, which is Shanghai Organization. The latest declaration even mentioned ASEAN countries, Shanghai Organization, ASEAN, Shanghai Organization 18 countries, ASEAN Association 10 countries. So theoretically, a total of about 30 countries. So across this region, within this framework, we might conduct a cooperation of trade and economy. So it's easy to see the significance that this cooperation might have. I think Mr. Alimov, as the general chairman of Shanghai Organization, with his huge experience and energy and enthusiasm, should be able to, during his term, to be able to make a progress besides accepting India and Pakistan into this organization. So we're hoping for this, because the speech gave us great hopes for Shanghai organizations. And finally, the bilateral trade economic relations. Trade economic cooperation continually has been and is an important content of Russian-Chinese relations. During 25 years, we've been making great breakthrough progress in terms of the amount, quantity from $5 to $7 billion to $590 billion. That's prior to crisis. Last year saw the turnover $9.5 billion. That indicated the growth of our cooperation. We all here not satisfied with the state of our trade economic cooperation in terms of quality as well as in terms of numbers and quantities. In the context of One Belt, One Road, we noticed one interesting phenomenon, that this connection and correlation strategy development goes a long way towards helping trade economic cooperation. There was an opinion, not only in Russia, but also among Chinese experts, opinion that the volume of trade of trade turnover in between Russia and China was maybe around $60–70 million of US dollars. If anything more, that would likely mean that Russia more exporting to China more exporting its raw materials to China, which would not be counter to interest of China. That was one stereotype which still stays in the way. At present, our cooperation is proceeding across three main areas. The first area being, I'm referring to correlation of strategies of development. The first is correlation of strategy in at regions. As I mentioned, two joint declarations about the correlation of Eurasian Union and One Belt, One Road program. The second area, correlation of the power sector. About 9 years ago, I had a very serious conversation with very high-ranking official in Russia. The topic of conversation was the amount of imports from Russia to China of raw materials, of raw oil, import from Russia to China. At present, we spoke about 15 million tons. On the Russian side, there was a proposal maybe to raise this level up to 30 million tons of oil to China. Our Russian friends were saying it was not possible at the time, 9 years ago, because for Russia, the ceiling of export to China of raw oil was 20 million, they were saying to us. Anything more than that would mean that Russia would be dependent on Chinese imports, which would be against strategic interests and energy interests of Russia. And in 2015, you know, what was the amount of export of oil from Russia to China? 41 million tons. Last year saw 52 million tons. Why it came to pass this way? Because we carried out this correlation, this joining up of energy strategies. This is very important. We as experts, we need to find that particular point of correlation, of joining up of our common interests. And the third statement, for many years we've been speaking about the cooperation at local levels. At present there's three areas at that level. First is developing of Siberian Far East and also northern eastern areas of China. Also cooperation between sister cities. Third, cooperation between cities along the rivers Vinza and Volga. To be honest, we've been speaking about for many years. There's almost no progress for many years. No progress. Why? Another stereotype is in the way. But over the last 2 years, there has emerged. I'm very optimistic about it now, about this phenomenon. And the Maritime 1, Maritime 2. Maybe not everybody is in the audience is familiar with what is Plenary 1, Plenary 2. Those are international transportation corridor. Plenary 1 is aiming at the province Nizhyn, bordering on Russia. Plenary 2 aiming at province Terrain. In theory, let me also mention that this idea actually emerged about 10 years ago among Chinese experts. The way it was formulated, taking Chinese cargoes out of beyond the territory of the China, but beyond the border of China, but not outside the country. What does it mean? It means the northern infrastructure of China is overloaded. It's difficult for us to transport our shipments from north to east, whilst Russian transportation capacity, they're quite available. So if we can use Russian infrastructure capacities to transport freights within China from north to east, not outside of the country, but within the China, it will definitely mean mutual benefit for both Russia and China. And the main thing, the volume of shipments of cargo, if we are to believe the data provided by experts, will be $45 million a year. What it means? It means half of the transit shipments. is the capacity of Transip. And the capacity of Transip is 45 million every year. So far, it remains at the level of concept, but this concept has already been approved by Russian government. So this process is quite urgent too. What I want to say with this, the potential of cooperation between Russia and China is huge. We have to be aware of this completely. We have to tap into this completely. And that's what our job is, to tap into this huge potential. And I want to conclude my speech with these words. Thank you. Thank you, academician Andrei Kakoshin, the Dean of the Department of International Policy of the Moscow State University, MGU. Thank you. Our dear Chinese friends, dear colleagues from the Russian Federation, today we already touched upon the subject of strategic stability in Russian-Chinese relations. We have a very important document signed by two leaders of Russia and China. I would like to say a few words about how we should build our activity in this area, medium-term and long-term prospects. In the past, strategic stability, there used to be Soviet-American, Russian-American documents as far as strategic stability. Those documents still remain valid and relevant, but the emergence of Russian-Chinese document indicates and signifies totally new stage in the development of the whole system of international policy, and definitely as far as the relationship between Russia and China. Here, Russia and China are acting not as an adversaries or antagonists, which used to be Soviet Union, United States, and in a way, Russian Federation and United States, but as partners here that outline the common vision of this shared issue. Now, there's no other paradigm today besides paradigm for strategic stability when it comes to discussion of the serious, momentous issues of international security, reduction, and limiting arms. There are no other paradigm as yet for this. So this document makes a very important contribution towards this. As a result, now we have three, as a minimum, interpretations of strategic stability. We have traditional narrow interpretation relating to the strategic nuclear armaments. We have a broad interpretation which includes the state of affairs as far as the general arms and weapons. And there's a practically comprehensive interpretation of strategic stability which concerns the state of the system of international policy, international relations. I think that all these three kinds of interpretations, they're quite viable, but for us, in practical terms, in terms of practical application, therefore China and Russia, most important here is the development of thinking through joint studies. As far as the broad interpretation of strategic stability, the thing is, there's increasingly international security is dependent on the state of affairs in particular regions, potential theaters of hostilities. My colleague, academician Rogov, spoke about this in quite detail. We pay a lot of attention to what's happening in respective areas of Pacific Asian region. We are interested in ensuring strategic stability at a pre-nuclear level and at Euro-Atlantic region. That's the zone that directly borders on the Russian Federation. Here, with our Chinese colleagues, we have one very important touch points of shared understanding. The thing is, technologies that drive strategical stability that affect the state of affairs as far as international security in terms of military dimension, those technologies are developing very rapidly. So that understanding of strategic stability, which we had only 20 years ago, it's no longer adequate to the new realities that exist today. I think that, as was noted, in this joint Russian-Chinese declaration on strategic stability. That's very important as a beginning. So I encourage our colleagues from Chinese scientific centers and institutes to follow up on the development of this topic for the sake of the interests of security of our both countries, for our common interests of security. Thank you. Thank you, Andrei Afanasьевич. Dmitry Vitalyevich Chenin.
Спасибо большое. Когда здесь говорится об изменениях мирового порядка, надо иметь в виду, что один из важнейших факторов этих
We need to bear in mind that as far as the changing the world order, or the world order changing, is one of the important factors is the resumed rivalry between great powers. Is the resumption of this great rivalry is more than any other factors that affect the changing world order, changes in the world order. This rivalry is in many ways tragical phenomenon of international relationships, because it would seem that so much exists between great powers, so many points of contact, shared interests, shared issues. But still, the history of international relations indicates that disagreements, quite often of fundamental character, tend to prevail and predominate over the awareness of the commonality of interests. I think that today it's as fair to say as it was fair to say in the past. The rivalry today is, first of all, visible along the line of Russia and the United States and China. Those are different lines of rivalry, but those are the lines that drive the future. Besides, at the regional level, there also exists a whole mass of other lines of rivalry and animosity that also exert a lot of influence on the changing world. Under these conditions, I think the main thing is to avoid confrontations, head-to-head confrontations, which I think are much more likely than many of us tend to think. At least as far as Russian-American relations, despite the fact that, unlike the period of Cold War, to say that there exists the danger of large-scale conflict, there's no reason to say that, but collisions that might lead to serious escalation, unfortunately, are quite likely. Those are collisions between planes, ships, armed forces, divisions of armed forces of the United States and Russia. I think that to one or another degree, it also applies to relationship between China and the United States. So under these conditions, to avoid confrontations, collisions is the most important priority as far as the short-term priorities. Russian, Chinese, American relationships, they have been already spoken of today. They look not so much as a triangle today, the form which was drawn at the times of Henry Kissinger. But now it's as a more complex, more multi-dimensional form in which there exists very complex, sometimes contradictory interactions. But still, it's those relations between these two countries that will drive more than anything else the future character of international relations, I think. The rivalry between Russia and the United States, the rivalry of China and the United States is taking place under the conditions of strategic agreement between China and Russia. This particular consensus on agreement, I think, enables one to start to build new formula of international order, which further in the future might become an element of future global order. Since the new order is building new order is not reduced just to throwing down the United States off the pedestal from which the United States started to climb down, which is the position of dominant power. It's specifically building the new relationships among big powers. Here, the relationship between China and Russia, I think, is the basis for this principally new international order. This relationship, much has been spoken of about it today, definitely needs further strengthening. I think we are at advanced stage of this, but still ahead of us much work to do yet. So relationship between Russia and China may be considered as a model for the new international order. New order needs also expanding. It's been spoken today here about the near future expansion of Shanghai Organization by including into it such great power as Hindustan and as a big power as Pakistan. In my view, it's a very serious challenge to Russian diplomacy, to Chinese diplomacy, and also, of course, to the diplomacy of those countries that are acceding to the Shanghai Organization. Because unless one makes very serious efforts to formulate new relationships between Russia, India, and China, then the expansion of the organization might not be for the good of this organization. Shanghai Organization with more members might prove to be a weaker organization, which might not be able to achieve consensus among its ranks on most important issues, and that's a serious challenge. But if this challenge is accepted, then across Eurasia, there may be formulated basis for new continental order, and that might be very serious progress and headway as far as changing the character of modern international relations in a positive way, in a positive direction. And finally, cooperation between America and Russia, and of course between China, between America and Russia and China, United States, America. It's developing alongside their rivalries. This cooperation also has a huge significance for the formation of the future international order. There's much to say here about the prospects of cooperation among three great powers, but I would like to say only the following. When discussing the prospects of development of international relations, one needs to take very seriously into consideration what's happening on the internal political arenas, particularly what's happening in the political arena of the United States of America. According to my impression, the United States have entered into the most acute and apparently quite a long-running year and a half, 2-year internal political crisis of the depth and the scale which none of us probably had ever seen in our living memory in the United States. So what we're talking here about, not only about the unpredictability of the administration of Trump, so far its foreign policy not yet developed, about various contradictory steps being taken by Washington. We're talking here about that today's political situation in the United States is characterized by the increasing instability. And this is what we had never had to face, never had to deal with. But this will have a huge significance in terms of international relations, among other things, for relationships between three great powers. Thank you. Thank you, Fyodor Alexandrovich. As well known, the final words typically are remembered, so I give you the chance to speak the final words. Fyodor Alexandrovich Lukyanov, editor of the journal Russia and Global Politics, and one of our brilliant publicists and commentators. Thank you very much. Came to see it during the session today that when Russia and China get together, we're capable of pretty much anything. We can overcome anything. Today, we've scored brilliant victory over such phenomena of one polar world as schedule. Thank God this bourgeois invention doesn't apply to us, so we can speak a limited amount of time. But I have a very more serious four, which is the lunch. So I have three statements to make. First, I want to speak in the defense of the title of the conference. So the proposition towards new quality, I don't recommend removing this proposition towards. We have not achieved new quality yet. We have achieved new quantity. Yes, that's obvious from the great number of meetings, events, dialogues, negotiations, so on. But as for the quality, it's still something ahead of us yet, something we have yet to achieve. It's not just the matter of Russia and China working poorly on this, even though there are reserves, lots of reserves all over the place. But the thing is, we are totally lost in the world that's emerging. For objective reasons, it's not clear at all as to what's going to happen next. A period has concluded when the starting point of policy for all leading players, China and Russia, United States and European Union, was the point of the ending of Cold War. That was the starting point of reckoning. And everybody made their own reckoning, respectively. The West made this reckoning, being in a state of euphoria and being totally delighted with themselves, thinking that what had happened at that time was the universal factor that legitimized anything else. Russia made its reckoning, calculating and wishing to prove that what happened in the past was a historical accident, was not something irreversible, so we can still go back to it. Whilst China, in a sense, was on the sidelines of this, but still was the main beneficiary of all those changes, as became clear over time. Because China was very careful in utilizing all those opportunities which were provided by the collapse of Russia and success of the West. It was very careful and neat, stepping into the system, building into the system, hoping to change the system in its interest strictly through evolution. Now, all the apexes, pinnacles of those triangles are in the situation when this point of reckoning is no longer yields anything else, provides nothing else. To the West became clear what they had been counting on had failed to come to pass. Something else is happening, so they need to review assessments of the past and review the view of the future. Russia, I think, has completely exhausted what could be drawn, what could be obtained from this spirit of revenge. Everything that could be done was restored, and now to move further along this narration as to how Cold War ended and how injustice. Nobody's interested in having this. Imagine the administration of Donald Trump. It's difficult to imagine people in Trump's administration who would be prepared to listen to this. Russia was done by unjustly. Fine, let's move on. So I think one is to move completely the angle of viewing, angle of different outlook. As for China, I think fundamental change is happening here too. My colleagues mentioned already that China, in particular speech by Chairman Xi Jinping at Davos, China appeared to take up the flag of globalization, which became kind of crooked because the changes in America. Actually, there's not much left, nothing actually to pick up, even if China was willing, even though it's not clear whether China is actually willing to pick up the flag of globalization. But globalization came to be under threat, not because China or Russia grew stronger or India grew stronger, but because the societies in those countries which had initiated this process of globalization, now they take a different view on this. They no longer see it as beneficial. That means they will proceed to undermine this process themselves, and nothing can be done about this by any of us. This is the events from in those countries, and we won't be able to build into that. Russia has failed to build into this anyway, but China has built into the system, is part of the system. But now China will have to change their point of view by either assuming very serious initiative of leadership, for which I think China is not yet ready, or through evolutionary development. They won't be able to evolutionarily develop this order by getting inside it, because the order is being eroded. So all of us are in a situation where we need to not simply to adapt to new conditions, but we need to develop totally new outlook on things, on the world, and we don't have this new outlook yet. When the world when the Cold War ended, the concept of new world order, it was cited many times, starting from Mikhail Gorbachev, then was picked up by George Bush Sr., and so on. But if we recall, especially after the breakup of the Soviet Union, this concept was not spelled out particularly. What was this new order was supposed to mean? It seemed to be implied that it was about American domination, but no more than that. At the same time, in terms of articulation, there's a concept of new European order that was well articulated, which was basically created as a prototype for the future world order. That's a Western-centric, NATO, European Union-centric, European construct, which would gradually, by and by, would expand to absorb all the rest eventually. It failed to come to pass. What was planned did not come to pass. Something different emerged. So the question is now, what is going to be the center and prototype of this new world construction, as far as if it's possible at all? Here I completely agree with Dmitry Trenin that potentially this new testing ground should be not an expanded Europe, but expanded Eurasia, where Russia and China will play and should play leading role. So far, despite the abundance of organizations we set up, in terms of anything single, we don't have anything single, but over time, hopefully, we'll get some single entity. And finally, also, Dima raised this issue. It's very important, I think, to make it sharper, the dangers which we face in this world. It's not just the problem that Trump is irresponsible, unpredictable, or nouveau-ish, which has broke through into international politics and now starting to behave as an elephant in a porcelain shop. Trump is not a cause of what's happening, it's a product. He has been created by the deep crisis of American political system and global political order, which we are witnessing. He's a product of this. And the struggle that's taking place now in the United States, unfortunately, the United States being the country which sets the tone in international policy, I think those trends will continue to be transported to other places. This struggle turns international politics overall into the internal instrument. Russia was often accused of this, sometimes quite justly, but the scale of this we're witnessing today, I think, is surpassed anything Russia could ever imagine. That when not only Trump starts to strike sovereign states with missiles, specifically to resolve some internal issues, but the main thing is his opponents do not at all care about how their actions will affect international stability, because their main priority is in some way to push away the president they don't like. So this situation, for one thing, is horribly dangerous, and it's totally new. We're not prepared for this. So the schemes, the paradigms we discuss, even that wonderful triangle, it's unable to function if within the apexes, pinnacle of this triangle, if people there are thinking not so much about how to strengthen this structure, but about what's happening around them and how those different directions in the triangle to use them in their internal struggles. That's extremely dangerous. So this epoch of era of strategic irresponsibility, whose symptoms we're witnessing, it may prove to be much more worse than even the cursed one-polar world that we're moving away from. Thank you. Thank you, Frederick Alexandrovich. When you speak of new European order as a historian, I tend to recall concepts of the 20th century for Europe. new world, but unfortunately, it's proved to be chimera, imagination. Now we conclude with this. I want to thank the speakers. I want to apologize for running late on our schedule, and I suggest we get back here half hour later after shortening our lunch time. Thank you.